Could Iraq be pulled into a conflict between the United States and Iran? Iraqi leaders are caught in the middle as the US ramps up its rhetoric. What's needed to reduce the tension and prevent war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. The United States is raising the stakes against what it calls threats from Iran. President Donald Trump is sending an extra 1,500 troops to the Middle East, and he is bypassing Congress to sell billions of dollars of weapons to Iran's rivals, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Iran's neighbour, Iraq, is vowing support and offering to mediate, but at the same time, Iraq is wary of straining relations with the Americans. Rob Mattison reports from Baghdad.
If Mohammad Javad Zarif came to Baghdad to clarify where Iraq stands in the ongoing tension between the US and Iran, Iraq's foreign minister seems to have given him an answer.
We are against the unilateral measures taken by the US. We are standing by Iran in its position, and God willing, we can play an intermediary role between the parties if necessary.
Iran's foreign minister has proposed signing a non-aggression pact with Gulf neighbours, but Iran says it will take action if necessary.
We will defend ourselves against any efforts for a war with Iran, whether it is a military or economic one that would victimize the Iranian people. We will face it with strength and resistance.
Iran and Iraq have close ties through trade, culture and religion. But Iraq relies on US and foreign troops to combat the threat of ISIL, and it needs foreign investment, especially to develop its oil fields. Iraq has been doing a diplomatic balancing act for years, and some say that puts it in a perfect position to be able to mediate between the United States and Iran. But to do it successfully, like most negotiations, it has to be seen not to take sides. There are also fears that some Shia armed groups in Iraq, who are allied to Iran, might decide to upset that balance. They might decide to take their own action, their own initiative against US assets in Iraq. Iraqis filled Tahrir Square in the heart of Baghdad on Friday, demanding that their government put Iraq's safety first and that their country should be at the center of talks to find a solution.
Iraq has become a bridge where meetings have been held at the Iranian embassy with European diplomatic missions. And it's taken the decision to start talks with moderate countries affected by the situation, to lobby the United States and Iran to try to extinguish the fires of war.
Iraqis may need more evidence to convince them that they won't be dragged into an unwanted conflict. Rob Mattison, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
Let's bring in our guest. Here in the studio is Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College, London. In Beirut, Sami Nader, Director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. And on Skype in Lancaster, Robert Gucci, Associate Professor at Lancaster University. He's edited and written books on the US politics, including the Trump presidency, journalism and democracy. Welcome to you all. Andreas, is the military buildup a sign of an imminent war? Is it just a classic example of gunboat diplomacy?
Yes and no. I think it's part of Trump's weird maximum pressure policy, which is about, how he's driven any of his business strategies before becoming president, which is basically putting maximum pressure on clients and then forcing them to basically give up and then come to the negotiation table. That might work in the business sphere, I'm not sure, but it definitely doesn't work in international relations. And when we see what's happening here with Iran is it's all about narrative here. It's about building up a narrative of a posture, signaling strength, power, and somewhat an escalation of tension, if you will, by always sending more troops, and making it look as if there was a build-up. In reality, I think it's not a build-up. All of this is within the realm of normal operations, but it is how this has been framed. I think it has been framed by the media in that particular way. It has been framed by the US government in that way to make it look as if the US is ready to go to war. I think we're still, hopefully, quite far away from a military escalation.
Sami, with the US accusing Iran and its proxies of planning attacks on American forces, how do you see this crisis contained and at what price?
I mean, here there is a point that Iraq, in particular, has no interest to be dragged into such a conflict. Now the Americans are putting pressure, they are building up militarily, but I don't think that they have an interest in waging a military action. Why? Because the economic sanctions are doing well, and they are putting enough pressure on Iran, and the military buildup, in my view, is, I mean, an attempt to dissuade any attempt from Iran to not to wage a war, but to resort to a military action in order to change the balance of power in the region and to try to achieve a breakthrough or any leak in these sanctions that are putting a lot of pressure on Iran economically and socially.
Robert, many try to depict this as most likely going to be an easy ride for the United States of America, but we're talking about Iran, a country with a huge influence in the region, upgraded military capabilities, particularly when it comes to its ballistic system, and they are there when you need them most in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So how do you see the potential for any military confrontation?
Well, I mean, part of this, this has a history of how the presidents of the U.S. have treated the Middle East as being its own playground for military testing, selling of goods, and really creating an other that does shape, as your first guest said, a narrative of us versus them. Donald Trump's, quite frankly, I think more interested in how this plays out in the media spotlight, what the images look like and what his rhetoric is that probably creates some chuckles back in the United States for his supporters. He's more interested in the 2020 presidential election and bringing that to his side, which is probably a great likelihood here, than he is about altering any of the past procedures and processes of the U.S. government, which has been to maintain tension in the Middle East. So I don't see this going to a massive war because of somebody making a mistake on the ground here of the high tensions, but I do see it possibly happening based on the rhetoric that's being thrown back and forth across the oceans.
Andreas, common sense says that there is no indication of a massive military confrontation, but mistakes happen in between.
Absolutely.
An incident can trigger a massive confrontation.
Yes. And I think that's where we are in the era of weaponized narratives. So narratives are not just in the information space. It creates real tensions, and it is actually matched up with action as well, as we see with the deployment of particular components of the U.S. military into the Gulf. At the same time, the other side, the Iranians are responding with narratives, but they are also playing with fire. They are maintaining one of the biggest networks, or the biggest network of surrogates across the Middle East. Many of these surrogates, and it's very important to highlight here, are not part of the command and control system of the Iranians. They act on their own. They're almost autonomous. The Houthis, for example, receive massive support from Iran, but are still an independent actor, and they might play the role of a spoiler. So we've got these tensions. We've got two relatively rational state actors here, Iran and the United States, not willing to escalate, not wanting a war. And then you have a lot of gray area operations, particularly by Iranian surrogates across the region, which might be wanting to test the resolve of the U.S. government and trying to escalate. And in this kind of, in this kind of space, there's a lot of room for error, which might just blow the entire powder keg open.
Sami, you've mentioned earlier Iraq's role in mediating in the crisis. But what can Iran achieve in this particular crisis?
I mean, Iran is trying through Mr. Zarif's visit today to leverage its position in Iraq, because Iran succeeded, at least since 2008 up to 2015, to exert control inside Iraq. Plus, it developed and it supported some proxies, some militia proxies, whether Kata'ib Hezbollah or Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, Badr Brigade. There are 4 militias that are under Iranian control. However, there is a change in the Iraqi society, and it was the big sign of this change was the demonstration that took place yesterday. Today, there is a big swath of the Iraqi population that refuses the meddling of Iran in their affair, and they want peace, and they want to distantiate themselves from not only from Iran but from the Washington as well. The leader of this protest of yesterday, he's a staunch enemy of Washington, which is Muqtada al-Sadr. So there is a growing movement inside, a growing mood inside the Iraqi population that they have paid enough the price of others' war, and they want peace, and they want to distantiate themselves from this conflict taking place between Tehran and Washington.
Which brings me to ask Robert this question about the irony of suddenly having Iraq passing on messages back and forth between the US and Iran. What can the Iraqis achieve when they are partly beholden politically to the Americans, but at the same time beholden to the Iranians?
Well, it is quite ironic when the U.S. government came out and said that non-essential U.S. Military should leave, as though the country of Iraq was not safe for Americans anymore. It was a bit of an irony after everything that the U.S. government did to say that it was safe. I mean, Iraq is in a tough spot here. But to be completely clear, the U.S. is using kind of the idea that Iraqis don't want quote unquote freedom or quote unquote democracy, which they may or may not want. They're using that as a scapegoat for allowing Iraq to be into these tight spots where they don't necessarily know who's which side to go on. It's a tough call here to try and play this middleman with particularly with Donald Trump on the U.S. side, and so this tension, and if this fails, and if Iraq isn't able to perform as some sort of mediator well enough to make the United States happy anyway, then the White House is just going to sit back on its heels and say, well, we tried to do everything we could for this nation, and it's just not working out, without taking the responsibility for U.S. intervention in societies other than their own, particularly in the Middle East.
Andreas, you've said earlier that both parties are exaggerating their capabilities, are trying to use it in a way to frame their own narrative. We've seen the Iranians at the same time saying that any warship that goes into the area could be sunk by secret weapons, Iranian secret weapons. We've heard also Rouhani floating the idea of triggering a referendum on the nuclear agreement. How genuine is this from the Iranians?
I mean, I think to talk about the referendum, the Brexit vote has shown actually how bad referendums work on some such delicate issues. And I think the Iranians are just, this is again posturing, trying to maybe find an attempt to politically justify why they stick or don't stick with the deal. I wouldn't take that too seriously. When it comes to the capability question here, the Iranians obviously have that surrogate network, of which they control some more than others. But they also do have hard conventional capability, particularly in the realm of ballistic missiles. And I think this is where much of the concern is here in the Gulf, in the GCC, Arab GCC countries, in terms of the capability that Iran can bring to bear. They have an absolute overload of ballistic missiles of different ranges that the air defense systems on the Gulf side, of the Arab Gulf side, could not be dealing with. The Americans know that. They would be overwhelmed completely. And they have capability to strike, as they said, US warships, not really with secret weapons here. We know that how these weapons operate. They're relatively sophisticated, but their US infrastructure is definitely very vulnerable to this. And I think what is key here now is to understand that the Gulf doesn't want, not Saudi, not the Qataris, not the Emiratis, want a major combat operation, because they would be the first ones to suffer from the backlash and retaliation from Iran.
Sami, we've heard also the Iranians say that they have quadrupled the uranium enrichment to 3.65 6-7%, which was within the limits of the 2015 nuclear agreement. But isn't this an indication that the Iranians are saying that at the same time they are also ready to pull the plug on the deal if the situation gets worse?
Yeah, but I don't know how smart is the move, because sticking to the nuclear deal helped them to create and to deepen the divide between America on one side and Europe on the other side. And this was very helpful to Iran upon the last decision. And this will help or will push them to more isolation. I think that Iran doesn't have any interest in a classical type of war. Just to build up on your last question with the guest, I think that Iran has developed smartly some very efficient military asset. One is called the proxies, the second is the ballistic missile, and putting the ballistic missile in the hand of the Houthi and training militias in Iraq and Lebanon that could at any point threaten American interest, but without bearing any responsibility. This was part of Iran's strategy in the region. So I won't be surprised if Iran, if it wants to retaliate, if it has no other choice, it's so much under economic pressure and it has to retaliate, it will use one of these proxies at their command.
Robert, but when you have the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, saying or delivering a rare rebuke to Rouhani and Mohammad Jawad Zarif, blaming them for some of the blunders on the nuclear deal, saying that it's riddled with ambiguities. Is he trying to say that if I decide to step in, it is going to be really tough action from my part?
Well, you know, I think these deals are often struck with very fine lines between them, and there's always a hedging of bets when you go into these types of negotiations, it seems, in the sense that we expect the other party to constantly perform as it always said it would, and that there's an expectation that I would perform the way that I said that I would. But times change in the sense of how these negotiations go on and how they end and how you feel at the end of those negotiations, particularly when you have pressures from outside the region pushing one way or the other. So we have to be cautious in the West, particularly on how we talk about war and how we talk about striking another nation, because these lines are always moving, and there's always a lot of tension. One wrong move from the White House in particular can really get these parties to jockey a very tense situation that they're already balancing.
Andreas, to what extent is John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, is the key player now in shaping this whole policy against Iran?
Well, I wouldn't call him a policymaker, because there is no real strategy or policy here. I think it's pure ideology. And, you know, the funny thing is that someone like Bolton would always go and say the mullahs, the deep state of the mullahs in Iran, they're all ideological they're players that, you know, they're irrational. If you look at Bolton, he is on that same level. He's an extremist ideologue, obviously not an Islamist one, but on the other end of that spectrum. And he is driving the narrative. And he has for years been trying to frame Iran as the menace in the region, the biggest threat to national security, without any substantiated evidence. So everything he does is he's framing that securitization effort, which is basically creating a threat out of nothing, trying to look for pretexts that he can then use and blame on the Iranians. And I think him and Pompeo in particular are also the ones who are framing the White House, who are pushing the White House to say, look, you need to do something about Iran, despite the fact that Donald Trump himself doesn't want a war. And he's run on a ticket in 2016 saying, I don't want another war in the Middle East. So why would he escalate with Iran, of all players, where the US stands the least chance of actually coming out with a victory?
Sami, many have been saying that the Iranians' reaction to the American move has been blown out of proportion. But, I mean, for any Iranian military strategist, if you have someone like Bolton on the other side of the Atlantic, pushing for an agenda, saying in the past that he thinks Iran should be bombed to set back the clock in its nuclear program. Don't you think that the Iranians should be really genuinely concerned about what's happening on the ground?
I think they are concerned, and I do believe that they want to negotiate, but they are still waiting for November 2020 because they prefer to negotiate with someone different than Trump. There is always this nostalgia in Iran and among Iranian circle to the Obama era. And this era will not return. And there is some kind of trend to put all the blame on the hoax in the American administration. And there are hoax like Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Bolton. However, this doesn't, justify Iranian behavior on the ground. The fact is, during the last year, the war on terror eclipsed the problem with Iran. Now that the war on terror is over, all the lights are shed on Iranian behavior. That's creating problem among the Arab region, among regional power, with Israel, even with Turkey, that is a member of the Astana Club. That means there is something in Iranian behavior that needs to be addressed in order to find a peaceful settlement for this crisis.
I see your point, but I think this is going to be my question to Robert. But there are issues also to be addressed with the Trump administration because, common sense, we're talking about one of the most volatile, dangerous areas in the world, beset by conflicts in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, in different parts of the region. But suddenly you're trying to create a conflict that could degenerate into a protracted military confrontation. How do you see it, Robert?
Well, the really scary part here is if this is a Donald Trump play at the short game, in the sense that a Republican candidate would do much better as a wartime president. And certainly you mentioned that Donald Trump has said he hasn't wanted to have a war across the seas, but we are seeing an escalation of the militarization of the southern border of the United States and using tear gas on children, militarization of that southern border. So, at the same time, he says he wants to have some sort of peace. That certainly doesn't mean everywhere. But, so the short term here would be that there is some sort of military escalation where he can fly across, meet with troops, secure that part of his vote. And not really thinking about the long game. I think it's pretty likely we have a second term for him. Mm-hmm. And if this is how he's playing the short term, it's kind of scary how he would play out the long term. If there were an escalation, how does that stretch out over years?
These are interesting times anyway, Andreas, in the US. If you compare Trump to Bush, Bush had a global coalition and he had the backing of the Congress. Trump doesn't seem to have neither when it comes to the war or the push against the Iranians. Isn't this likely to be doomed to failure?
Absolutely, and that's why I'm saying we are still hopefully very far away from a military escalation here, because none of the components that the Bush administration could rely on in 2003 are given. We don't have the pretext of 9/11 that could be blamed on the Iranians. We're having smaller pretexts now here in the region that are still not conclusively attributable to the Iranians. And the problem is that even the entire administration, Trump, is not behind this move. It's not like they speak with one voice. The American people are in majority against this military escalation. There's just people on the fringes, extreme fringes in Washington that are pushing that line. And I don't think that they have the kind of leverage to push a president like Donald Trump into the war zone if he refuses to do so.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but it would be interesting to see how this crisis unfolds in the coming days. Andreas, Krieg, Sami Nadia, Robert Gushue, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.